Welcome to the second episode of Beyond the Page, a video production series here at Coastal Carolina University where students read from and then discuss with a faculty member afterwards creative writing that they've written here in their time here. I'm Hastings Hensel, coordinator of creative writing, and I'm with my former student Connor Uptegrove, whose poem Motor won the 2018 Fall Broadside, Paul Rice Broadside Poetry Contest. And Connor is a senior communication major. He is a poet, a playwright, an essayist, a literary journalist. His plays have received attention from Off-Broadway Playhouse, the Barrow Group in New York City, and his work has appeared in Arcarios Literary Magazine, Tempo Magazine, the Athenaeum, the Odyssey, and other publications. I've asked Connor to read Motor and then speak with me afterwards about writing the poem specifically and writing in general. Thanks, Connor, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Would you mind reading us Motor?
I'd be happy to. Motor. Detroit is just like everywhere else, only more so. A lot more so. Jerry Heron. Where column smoke is belched from plants and bronze is churned from callous palms, where grassroots rot, where backs are knots and pennies never drop through sewer drains, we grind the gears while fog floats up from flame that's smothered by the snow and billows through our nostrils, lungs, and motors. The capsized roadwork signs that taunt outgrown delusions made by whites and blues, red most of all. And this winter, what if our engines stop? If we trash the Packard plant, shred the punching cards, and tattoo the concrete giants with spray paint as they sleep, would you still drive that Chrysler, too old to be new and too young to be a classic? When we chuck a brick in a liquor store window, blow a hole in the rear mirror of your four-door Ford, torch the suburban corpse next door with the split 2x4 boards for a source of affordable entertainment without a rescue force to contain it, are we still as American as Kansas? If we pop Vicodin instead of acetaminophen and fall back to the Michigan soil and weeds? This is Detroit, the shattered ribs and bruised blue collarbone of heartlands falls in line for stamps for food, the twisted chain links. Booze-enameled, plush-filled toys are nailed to grime-encrusted wooden poles as kisses left. We are a motor built just like the rest.
Thank you. I love that poem. When I first read it, I immediately thought of this great Philip Levine poem, They Feed They Lion, about Detroit.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how the poem came to you, how maybe were you thinking about Detroit? Had you visited Detroit? Where did the epigraph come from? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
I had a layover. Completely arbitrarily. I was flying from here at the beach back home to Kansas City, Missouri. And just through a crazy winter storm, last Christmas across the country, I ended up having to fly from here at the beach to New York City in Christmas time, which is of course incredible and legendary, and then to Detroit, and then to Chicago, and then to Kansas City. So in 24 hours, I visited 5 completely different United States cities, and during that time, it's very hard to create meaning out of anything. It's hard to latch onto one single idea, scene, or image. But that being said, Detroit completely stuck out to me. I had a weird interaction with a couple of Detroit natives, and so from there I just wanted to learn more. And that's how this poem came about. I was completely fascinated by this sort of nearly deceased U.S. city, and I wanted an autopsy. Frankly, I wanted an autopsy, and more importantly, I wanted to see what was left, what survived. And I found that Detroit natives were what survived, and so I wanted to write about that.
I've been to Detroit once, and I remember thinking as a South Carolinian that there's so much 18th and 19th century here, and that's the 20th century in Detroit.
Absolutely.
But now we're in the 21st, and there is kind of a retro perspective there.
Absolutely.
I love the rhythms of this poem, all of your poems. It
Thank you.
begins in sort of straightforward iambic pentameter, and then the sonic textures, the internal rhymes of rot and knots and drop, and the assonance and the consonants, and that's just really in the first few lines, and it sustains itself throughout the poem. And I know that you have a little bit of a background in music or slam poetry. Can you speak to the relationship between sound and the writing of this poem or poetry in general?
Sure, what a great question. So, as far as this poem in particular, you're right, it is in iambic pentameter through that first stanza right there, and it also goes back to it in the last one as well.
Yeah.
And so really my kind of original vision for it was I wanted to write a sonnet and then have it just be split up in the middle by crazy language where I hope it kind of comes off the page, you know, the lines like, you know, rear mirror of your four-door Ford, or chuck a brick in a liquor store window, you know. And so that was sort of the frustration of the character that I think is in this piece, which is Detroit natives,
Yeah.
of seeing their city go through something like this. And so that's, I think, as far as the sounds, but also I think that, you know, poetry and this whole kind of world that we write in is going through an evolution right now. So many young poets were brought up on the wordsmith of artists like Kendrick Lamar and Eminem and Biggie and people like that. And you know, I'm definitely a product of that too. And so I think that now we're seeing this sort of what was at the time kind of a rebellious art form in hip hop start to transition into and merge with sort of classic poetry.
Yeah.
And I think that there's kind of a really beautiful end product there too. I mean, we see people like Childish Gambino, you know, who's Donald Glover. He graduated with a creative writing degree from NYU.
Yeah.
You know, and so these two art forms that are just so inherently similar because of sound and imagery, they aren't having to be on either side anymore. They can come together and exist, you know, and I hope that this is kind of a representation of those two ideas merge and form.
I think it very much is.
Thank you.
What's interesting to me is that you're a playwright, you write essays, you write literary journalism, you write for magazines and even PR communications and things like that. And when the particular moment that you decided on this plane flight or in passing through Detroit that this would become a poem rather than a play or an essay or a piece of journalism, can you speak to, you know, why poetry for this moment and why plays for another moment?
Sure. I've also been completely fascinated by that, mostly because I am a writer that whenever I have an idea or an image that sticks out to me, usually immediately after getting a first, you know, few lines out, I can tell which shape it's going to take. And I think that that's completely individual to each writer. You know, some people it might take, you know, more develop on one side, but I think my main like piece of advice for that would just be to write one of them. You know, get it out, and at the very least, if you start writing an essay about, you know, some story or some narrative that you've wanted to follow and that you're passionate about, then just keep writing it. And even if you're halfway into an essay and you realize that it should be a poem, then you have, I'm sure, plenty of images to pick out from that essay, you know, and you have a better understanding of the meaning too. So just write until something sticks, and hopefully you get something.
Yeah, well, that's good advice. One of the hardest things, it seems to me, to write, especially maybe in poetry, is anger. This poem is angry. It uses words like shattered and bruised and grime and shred. Do you agree with that assessment? And I'm wondering maybe who the poem is addressed to, who would still drive that Chrysler?
Sure. I think, and this may be kind of the playwright in me, but I obviously kind of like look at things, you know, and maybe sometimes too much of a simple view of, you know, who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist, and kind of work from there. And so for me, I found this character that I wanted to write about, of a Detroit native, or Detroit natives as a whole, as a collective group. And when I heard their narrative and their story, I thought, who would they want to tell their story to? Who might have an impact on them that doesn't even know what they've gone through yet? And so I think that for me, the image kind of stuck out as the kind of just the headline readers, the the people who may not dive deep into a story,
Right.
And so for me, I wanted to kind of make an image out of that with someone who might drive a Chrysler, because
Sure.
Chrysler's
Sure.
famously made in Detroit, and then see if I could tell the story that Detroit natives want to be told to that audience, I guess.
That's really fantastic, because I think we tend to kind of abstract these horrific headlines, Flint,
Sure.
water, a lot of things coming out of Detroit that we
Absolutely.
don't always maybe pay close enough or deep enough attention to. Well,
Sure.
we're almost out of time, so I want to make sure I ask this question, because you've been writing for quite a while now, and I'm just sort of wondering what advice, general or technical or specific, that you might consider giving to other writers at Coastal and who are just maybe coming into writing.
Sure. I'd start out by saying that you have to drink so much coffee. That is the number one rule for being a writer. But on a serious note, I think that it's really important to start with a story rather than a theme.
Yeah.
I think that if you seek to write a poem like Motor about some broad topic like injustice, or even on a essay note like taxation or something like that,
Right.
it's gonna come out really boring.
Yeah.
Because you're starting with the theme and not the story. I fell in love with Detroit's story, and I wanted to pursue that. And so through that, I was able to write about all these themes in here because it was inherent in the narrative.
Right.
And so from that, I would say that find something that captivates you, that changes you, that moves you in some way, and pursue it relentlessly. Keep going until you dig up something that really, really kind of sticks with your heart. And that's the stuff that really is fun to write and fun to read as well.
Well, this has been a fun conversation, and this is a really great poem.
Thank you.
And thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks for being here. And we'll see you next time on Beyond the Page.